Good morning, everybody. This is for Sunday, June 7th. This is going to be very different than my other recordings. I've had a lot of hangups, and so I'm not even sure if this is going to work. So I've had a lot of problems trying to record, and so I'm going to keep this very brief. There's not going to be songs. There's not going to be announcements, except for to say, please be watching. We're going to try to do worship services next Sunday. So please be watching for announcements concerning that as we try to get that all figured out. But anyways, there's not going to be Lord's Supper on this video. There's only going to be a brief sermon. So we're going to go ahead and begin because, as I've said, I've had a lot of issues and I'm afraid I might have more, so I don't want to waste that opportunity to go ahead and do the lesson. So, we're coming back together next week, and there's a lot of situations right now where you're going to be asked to do things that might not be what you want to do. You're going to be asked to wear a mask. You might not want to wear a mask. You're going to be asked to sit in a seat, and I know this might seem silly, but some of us love our seats. You're going to be asked to sit in a seat that's not your own seat. And so I want to talk about that for a moment. How do we respond when we don't get the things that we want? How do we respond when things aren't our way? The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he's making a point here that he has some rights. And if you look at this, look at what he says in chapter 9, verse 4. He says, "Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife?" Verse 6. "Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living?" So Paul is trying to make a point that they have some rights. Paul and Barnabas have some rights. But Paul and Barnabas are sacrificing their rights. They're laying aside their rights. In our society, everybody is so hung up on their rights. Well, it's my right. Okay, but as Christians, we sacrifice that right. We sacrifice our rights for Jesus Christ, for God, for His will. We sacrifice that right for the good of others. Look at what Paul says here then in verse 12. He says, "Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right." They have rights, Paul says. We've not insisted upon these rights. And so we see this concept that comes into view here then of a Christian being willing to forget their rights for the benefit of others. Going to another text here, Romans chapter 14. Paul is talking in this text about what Christian principles and what you have a right to do. But he's saying that as Christians, we have to lay aside our rights. He's making a similar point here. That you have a right to eat this meat, you have a right to do this, but Paul's making a point that you lay aside your rights sometimes. You lay aside your rights for the benefit of others. Look at what he says here. I'm going to try to highlight this word here. This is Romans chapter 14. Paul says, "Whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable." Notice that word acceptable. We'll talk about it more in a second. It's the word that means pleasing. "Whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable or pleasing to God and approved by men. So then," look at his concluding statement here, "let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding." You see, that has to be what we're going for. When we come together next week, don't be worried about your rights. Be concerned about what is for the mutual benefit of your brothers and sisters. Pursue what makes for peace. Looking down here in the next chapter, see that word upbuilding? You'll see that same word here, right? So then he says in chapter 15, "We who are strong have an obligation." An obligation. This speaks to something that we need to do, what we must do. We have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak. Watch this. "And not to please ourselves." That's our obligation as Christians. Not to insist on our rights, not to be about pleasing ourselves. Verse 2, "Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up." You see, everything we do is about building up each other, about doing something that is good for the neighbor. And again, notice this word, please his neighbor. And I mentioned a moment ago, this word acceptable is translated also as pleasing. What is pleasing to God? Look at chapter 15 then. "And not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up." And then look at the example that Paul lays out for us. "For Christ did not please himself." You see, he's the example we follow. We don't strive to please ourselves when we come together. We shouldn't insist upon not wearing a mask. If it's for the benefit of our brothers and sisters, if it's for them, then we do it. We don't worry about what's pleasing to ourselves. We please our neighbor. We build him up. And Christ is the example of that mindset. And one more passage here. And I told you this is going to be brief today because I don't know if this video is going to record. But one more passage here. Going to the book of Philippians chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul is very focused on having a certain mindset. And he's calling Christians to have this mind. And he says in chapter 2, verse 5, have this mind. What mind? The mind that Christ had. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped. That word grasped means it's something that you insist upon. See, Jesus Christ did not insist upon his rights, his prerogatives, the blessings that were his. He didn't insist upon those. Instead, he emptied himself, verse 7, taking the form of a servant. And so that's our challenge next week when we come together. We need to take upon ourselves the form of a servant. We need to be willing to sacrifice our rights. We need to be willing to say, for the benefit of our brothers and sisters, for their mutual upbuilding, for making peace, I'm going to lay aside what I think, what I want. I know a lot of people are on all different sides out there regarding this pandemic. Some think it's nothing, there's no truth to it. Others are in great fear of it. And the truth is, as it pertains to us, who cares? As it pertains to us, what matters is that we come together. And I don't mean who cares as in that sense. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's real or not. My point is this: for the benefit of each other, we're going to do what's best for the church. Not what's best for Nathan House. Not what's best for you. Do what's best for the church. And if that means you wear your mask, you wear your mask. If that means you don't sit in your seat, you don't sit in your seat. So when we come together next week, we're going to ask you that you lay aside your rights and you be willing to sacrifice them for the well-being of the others, for the upbuilding of others, for making peace, for following the example of Christ. Romans chapter 15, Philippians chapter 2. And I apologize for the brevity of this lesson. Like I said, I recorded 2 others and I'm having problems. So anyways, I love you guys. So take the Lord's Supper on your own and say that prayer. And I apologize for the brevity of this. You guys have a great day. God bless.